Welcome to the Authority File, the podcast that features conversations about the life cycle of scholarly communication. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this series, which is brought to you with generous support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press, we'll be talking about podcasts, academic podcasts more specifically. Podcasts have been around for a while now, but they're still an emerging media in an academic context, both in terms of a disciplinary media studies approach and as a recognized scholarly communication format. Joining me on the program for the next 4 episodes are Laurie Beckstead, Associate Professor of Sound Media in the RTA School of Media at Toronto Metropolitan University in Toronto, Canada, and Dario Llinares, a writer, podcaster, and independent researcher. Laurie and Dario are editors of an upcoming book due in February from Wilfrid Laurier University Press called Podcast Studies, Practice into Theory. In it, they critically examine podcasting as a scholarly communication format and its use in pedagogy and research. In this second episode of our series, we take a closer look at the discipline of podcast studies and how it fits into the broader practice of media studies. We also talk about the medium's appeal to researchers and how it challenges the traditional principles of scholarly communication. Let's get into a little bit of sort of defining podcast studies as a discipline. So how does that fit into more general media studies, the idea of the discipline of studying podcasts?
Okay, this is me again. So I'll try and be brief because this is a big question, obviously.
Yeah. It's the question, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, there is huge overlaps in focus, which we spell out at the beginning, and they're fairly obvious, really. I think, that the idea of sort of technological mediation, so media studies, podcast studies, both fields consider how technology shapes creation and distribution of content, how platforms are set up, the relationship to the development of, say, the processes of streaming, the relationship to sort of YouTube is an interesting one in podcasting, and then now Netflix is getting involved with podcasting. So the technological part of it. Then there is the audience engagement or reception. So media studies traditionally explores, audience reception, interaction in various forms, and podcasting is obviously interested in those relationships, like, say, for example, the intimate relationship between podcast hosts and their listeners. And there's interesting stuff around media loyalty, or listener loyalty, I should say, and how behavior is influenced, and the relationship, say, between how listeners use the podcast apps in different kinds of ways to curate their experience of listening. And then there's even work on the idea of the phenomenological way in which we listen to things, whether on earphones or in the car, that kind of thing. And I've written a little bit on that in relationship to film. Then there is media economies, of course, and industry study. So that is a crossover for both areas. And of course, which is one of the ones, again, I mean, all of these are in our book, but a key one I've just sort of mentioned, the cultural and social impact. So podcast studies and media studies both examine how media forms shape and are shaped by these different contexts. So for podcast studies, this includes looking at the ways they create communities, how they serve as platforms for marginalized voices and reflect current trends, let's say. And then there's overlaps in methodology. So how you might examine podcasting, say, through textual analysis. I mean, we're particularly big in the book on ethnography and, the idea, particularly autoethnography. So if you're a podcaster, how are you using the podcast medium to kind of articulate your own experience? So you can be podcasting and then reflecting on your own podcast in the podcast,
right,
kind of thing, So there's a whole sort of mixed layer or a layering of things that are going on there when it comes to the approaches, when it comes to methodologies. And then things like media ecologies. So both fields look at media within larger ecologies of communication, the relationship between different forms. So the relationship between podcasting and film and television and radio and the internet, that I think is key within podcast studies. I mean, there's loads more. I could go on forever in
sure.
that, but those are the main sort of points, I would say.
Yeah.
And I feel like we almost did go on forever, Dario, in terms of grappling with somehow defining what we think podcast studies is, right? So we did offer, I think, 9 areas that, they overlap and there's plenty of subcategories in there, but we were able to kind of collate what people are doing in this discipline into 9 major areas, even starting with the very definition of what is podcasting, because believe it or not, we're still grappling with that. Does it have to include an RSS feed, or is that part of the inherent part of the medium? That sort of thing. But all the way to, all of the other things Dario discussed. And I think also one of the areas that's pretty significant for podcasting is pedagogy and scholarship, I think, in a way that other media have not taken space in that particular area. Podcasting has, since the get-go, since podcasting was invented, it was adopted into classrooms by teachers and professors. And so that's a huge area of podcast studies for sure.
Yeah. We'll definitely dig into that in an upcoming episode. But in the meantime, what makes podcasting appealing to academics in particular, as maybe not as a pedagogical practice just yet, but in terms of as a medium to discuss their own research or interests, what characteristics of podcasting provide opportunities for, for example, collaboration or dialogue and a personal touch for academics.
Right. The medium is based inherently in voice and conversation.
Right.
And so as an academic, I kind of feel that could there possibly be a better way to think through your work than doing so, out loud with other people, whether it's your direct peers in your same discipline or it's cross-disciplinary discussions, just this being able to have conversations about the work is so incredibly important. And podcasting is the perfect medium to afford that. So conversations, they allow us to situate the scholarship in its context. So it's coming from a real human being. And as real human beings, we all have our positionality. We all have our lenses through which we're coming at the work or perceiving the outcomes. And so having conversations with others can help us unpack some of those positionalities, I think, and sometimes even, positionalities that could be even hidden to the researcher themselves, right? And the idea traditional scholarship has always been meant to be depersonalized, right? So take I out of it, so that knowledge could be seen. I think it was a misguided attempt to make knowledge appear to be objective. It's this thing that has been created and now exists outside of the human realm, in a sense, right? It's objective, and but I think this way of thinking about knowledge as being decoupled from the humans who are creating it is really colonial in its perspective, right? That knowledge exists as this untouchable thing. It's separate from all of us. So I think conversation even allows us to, at least to a small degree, help to decolonize how scholarship is done. Through conversation, and lived experience. And there's also the fact that podcasting, at least so far, has kind of largely remained outside of the administrative structures of the university.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of scholars really appreciate that fact because it feels like a place where they can, exercise freedom from all of the constraints and expectations that come with academia. And which makes me think of my colleague Ian M. Cook, with whom I co-wrote a book along with Hannah McGregor called Podcast or Perish. He wrote a book in which he interviewed over 100 scholars who podcast to find out, why they do it. And many of them really wanted to do it because it wasn't constrained by the university. You know, they were doing something around their passion, their scholarship, their discipline that wasn't really dictated by conventions of the university. And also that, you know, in the same way that conversation has this humanizing effect, like it just makes you, it makes your scholarship feel more human. So sometimes I think academia can feel really kind of dehumanizing a little bit.
Right.
Like I remember being asked to create a CV in a format, and whatever format it was, the first thing they wanted was a number, and that number was like, how many publications do you have? Just a number. And I thought, that's awful. Like,
Yeah.
I know that, yeah, sure, I'm going to have a chance to list it later in the CV, but seriously, you just like, is that for someone to just look and we'll only take the ones with the highest numbers? Like, talk about depersonalization, right? So I think that podcasting, scholarly podcasting humanizes it. It takes it out of that kind of like box checking exercise, you know, oh, which, you know, is it published in a journal? Oh, which journal is it published in? Oh, that one counts more than this one. And, and then now it's going to be behind an expensive paywall, and, you know, and people may or may not read it. But because podcasting is based in this kind of face-to-face, or I guess more, you could say voice-to-voice conversation, I think it just makes it more human.
Yeah, that's interesting that, you know, going back to a little bit earlier, what you were saying about how academics kind of like the format because it allows them to sort of talk through their scholarship and research. But at the same time, though, they're doing this with an audience in mind, I guess. So it's serving that sort of personal sort of pursuit of maybe having a conversation with a fellow academic on the program, and sort of getting at the interdisciplinary aspects of whatever it is they're studying. But at the same time, there's presumably a group of people on the other side of this listening to them talk this through. So there is that extra dynamic of, yes, they're kind of having this conversation for their own interest, but also hopefully somebody else out there is also interested in hearing about that too.
Yeah, and I think the awareness of that potential audience really changes how the conversation goes,
Yes,
right? You
right.
need to be able to articulate your ideas in a way that could be digestible by a wider audience than simply, you know, the assumed audience of you know, paywall journals, academic journals. So I think that's a valuable thing too. Just even the awareness of the audience makes you think in a more, you need to be able to explain it in a more clear, concise, coherent way than maybe you've been thinking about it in your own brain. And yeah, so that's a great point, Bill.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, you know, we talked about sort of the way podcasts can exist outside of the sort of more traditional scholarly outputs. But again, at the same time, you know, how does podcasting challenge, you know, the traditional principles of scholarly communication? You know, particularly the idea of scholars producing objective research separate from their own history or values and life experiences.
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, it follows on from what Laurie was just saying, where the medium thrives on personal engagement and subjectivity. So scholars often present their research intertwined with their own perspective, with their own life histories and values, even. And as we've just discussed, that can be frowned upon in traditional academic contexts. And podcasting actively encourages you to do that. I mean, we talk about in the book this idea of the self-reflexive tendency. And it's unlike any other medium where it seems that there is an onus on producers, presenters, not to just create and do what they're doing, but actually explain somehow why it is they're doing what they're doing. You see this so much, not just in scholarly podcasting, but across the board. You know, I mean, one of the most salient examples for me of that is when Mark Maron had President Obama on. So he has this interview with the president, which is, you know, one of the sort of cultural crossover moments for podcasting, and then does an hour and a half episode on how the whole thing was done.
I remember
right?
that.
So it's that sort of, the form sort of lends itself to that interrogating the process of what you're actually doing. And of course, in academia, we have that should be inherent to the actual practice of research.
Mm-hmm.
That you're outlining how you got to the conclusion that you did, even in an arts and humanities context, right? So the format allows scholars to acknowledge their positionality openly rather than concealing it or pretending that it doesn't exist. I think another key aspect is the accessibility and informality. So, trying to disrupt that idea of the formal scholarly communication, the use of jargon, and the structural necessities of, say, the journal article,
Mm-hmm.
and particularly the way that is you're inclined to write and structure in a particular way. So podcasting allows scholars to communicate with a broader audience in the form itself, not just the idea of the distribution.
Yeah.
So hopefully this sort of breaks down barriers between between academics and the public, and the way that scholars are actually and academics are actually used on journalistic podcasts and other podcasts tries to place them in a context where it's accessible.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, related to, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask, do you think podcasts, because I know there are folks out there kind of poking at the medium as like, can this be, can this shift into sort of a recognized scholarly output, and I think, Lori, you were experimenting or looking at how peer review factors into podcasting, and,
Mm-hmm.
so I'm curious to see, like, can this be something that you could put on your CV, as a legitimate kind of published output that has a sort of recognized status within scholarly communication?
Yeah, I think we're finding that more and more universities are starting to understand this medium and see the possibilities
Mm-hmm.
of it as a form of scholarly output. I think a lot of institutions, just because they're they're big bureaucratic places and they tend to get stuck in their ways, that scholars who are podcasting have some work to do in terms of explaining why the work is significant, explaining how it is just as legitimate as other forms of scholarship. And I think the first question that gets asked is really, well, where's the rigor?
Yeah.
But we can explain where the rigor comes from via podcasting. It's partly, I think that scholarly podcasts need to be, in my definition of scholarly podcasting, scholarly podcasts have the potential to be peer reviewed.
Mm.
That is, you could check their citations, you could reproduce the work in some cases. That it's all sort of transparent and available there for peers to check should they wish to. But not all scholarly podcasts have to be peer reviewed, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
you could choose whether that's the route you want to go or not.
Right.
But basically, getting back to that question, I think we need to convince the universities that this is legitimate and that it is different. It's not going to just fit into the exact same, it's a square peg in a round hole, and we just need to make some square holes for in
Yeah.
the university structures to see this as legitimate. And there's so many ways in which scholarly podcasting does scholarship in new and progressive ways. So, for example, I think scholarly podcast, because it has that potential audience of anybody, that it needs to be a little more accountable to its communities, like the communities that the research is about or for, that those communities can participate now. And the medium itself, because it's serialized, we publish one podcast and, it's technically not a podcast if you're not serializing it. So there is an inherent built-in way of responding to and reacting to and addressing review, and whether it's from scholarly peers or peers outside of the academy, right?
Mm.
So everyone, because of the nature of it being serialized and also published digitally, you can have that conversation with the broader audience and you can be more accountable to them. And then you can incorporate those conversations and reactions into the next episode of whatever it is you're talking about. And so it's an ongoing creative way of creating knowledge.
Right. Excellent.
I hope that answered the question,
No,
because I just kind of went, woo.
Yeah, no, that was great. Thank you, Laurie.
But that's one of the things that the university doesn't like, and the university in the broadest sense, because like it goes back to what Laurie said at the beginning about one number. You know, academic publishing is about how many outputs have you published?
Yeah.
Have you completed? So most academics are therefore invited. They have to work under the proviso of, oh, I've written this paper or I've written this book and it's finished and it goes on my CV and I move on. You know, podcasting is about involving dialogues. It's about where work in progress is a ongoing, you know, is always the thing, you know, you're never complete in that sense. You know, if you talk about the Podcast Studies podcast, there's one every week. So when are we ever going to end? You know, if we have the time to do one every week, if you catch my drift. So that sense of conversation, you're always in conversation with not only another person, but yourself as a researcher and the subject and the discipline. So, and that goes against that sense of quantifying the value in terms of, like, you know, the economic value or the numerical value of what research is.
Yep. You just heard from Laurie Beckstead, Associate Professor of Sound Media in the RTA School of Media at Toronto Metropolitan University in Toronto, Canada, and Dario Llinares, a writer, podcaster, and independent researcher. Join us next week when we examine academic podcasting in practice as a pedagogical tool, a conduit to an academic adjacent audience, and as an important pathway to inclusive scholarship. As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising director, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.